Is it going well? Awesome. Good. Good morning, everybody. If we could have our panelists come take a seat. That's you, Lucy. Yeah, all right. Awesome. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Look, I want to, first of all, just commend some of you that I saw at 1 a.m. at Goal's house last night for being here tonight. I was there with you, so I know it's just wonderful to see you here in Brain House. I'm Steve Clemens. I'm editor-at-large of National Interest. And this topic that we're getting into is both avant-garde and new and just also vital. And it's one of these topics that I think I've been waiting for Patrick Kennedy, who I had a pleasure, years ago of sort of talking about every dimension of mental health, but also brain health, and talking about the building blocks of who and what we are for a long time. And I think now we're finally to get to a point where we've got a sophistication and a dexterity in beginning to talk about some of these issues. So we're going to talk about brain capital, unlocking workforce resilience and long-term economic growth with a fascinating panel I'm going to introduce in just a moment. But to help get us set up, I'm going to ask Rebecca Bagley, who's the president and CEO of the Kennedy Forum, to basically help give us an on-ramp into this discussion. So Rebecca?
Thank you so much for being here this morning. I know it's early on a Thursday. We're all sort of rolling in on these many days of Davos, so very exciting. And do I have to? Oh, there we go. So, the unlocking the brain capital piece, we thought that it was really important to kind of frame some of the issues, and particularly the issues and opportunities for employers. And we have some interesting Gallup data, too, that I'll talk about and point out our Gallup team as well. So just thinking about brain capital, there's really two elements. Brain health, which is mental health, substance use, it can be cognitive, they obviously kind of go back and forth a little bit. And then when we think of the cognitive skills and brain skills, it was really interesting. WEFT actually just did a survey of employers. If you haven't seen it, they just rolled it out right before the conference, thinking about what are the top skills that employers want. And it is all of these cognitive skills that you would think, like self-awareness, leadership, mindfulness, being able to connect with people and manage projects. And so I think, it's interesting because if you don't have one, it's hard to build on the other, right? So you need your workforce in a place where there's a balance, or else, having this heavy leadership is not my picture takers telling me to move over. So, but I also need to look at the slides a little bit. So there is a set of statistics I think that a lot of people have seen before, but we just wanted to kind of re-emphasize that we have a lot of dynamics going on that we've all been talking about this week that are shifting, for all of us in the world in general, and also just, with these base statistics. So 28% increase in people over 65. We think about brain disorders, and we're seeing an increased burden. And of course, those two things are somewhat related. The nature of work. I mean, I know I've been in a lot of conversations this week about just the nature of work and how that's changing. AI integration, other aspects into the nature of work. And then thinking about early brain development. There is so much information coming out, as we know, about how early brain development is so incredibly important. Obviously not necessarily an employer piece, except when I'll talk later about sort of, mothers and fathers and sort of the workers obviously have a lot to do with that as well. So when we think about, we're introducing with West Health, with our partner, the idea of really through the life course. So instead of, a lot of people think about youth mental health, which is incredible, think about the aging population. We really want to think about it across the whole life course and be able to define, what are the challenges, the opportunities, and how do you make sure that care and prevention and all of the different aspects are thought of across this whole continuum. These are just meant to be just examples. Of course, they don't encompass, nearly all of the different aspects of what happens at different areas. But when you think, just to highlight, a few, Postnatal depression is a huge issue, for parents. When you think about adolescents, 1 in 7 young people experience substance use issues, and that's only getting, worse, honestly, as accessibility gets so much higher. And then we think about the adult population, which we'll talk about a lot as we go through the presentation, because that's, a lot of the workforce for the companies that we're all running. And burnout has been a major issue. But then older adults as well. We're pulling more older adults into the workforce. There's caregiver, challenges for our workforce and our employees. So this, McKinsey helped us put this together, and Lucy's here. But it's so fascinating to think about the brain tax. It's a cost basically to the company. So if you flip that around, there's this huge strategic opportunity to be able to think about different elements, be a really comprehensive plan, hopefully, and be able to lead in a space to differentiate as a company. These numbers were staggering, though, even to me as I was looking at them. You think about untreated substance use. So for a company with 10,000 employees, this is an annual number, $7.2 million lost. Potentially, again, depending on the makeup, but the average is employee burnout, 11.2 million, and then elder care responsibilities, 1.5 million. So 10,000 person company, you think about what their revenue might be, and then when you look at these things, you have the potential to lose a significant amount of revenue if you're not thinking proactively, and maybe even spending a little bit of money to be able to solve for some of these issues. So I wanted to point out John Clifton's in the audience. Do you want to say hello? CEO of Gallup. And West Health and Gallup have a strong partnership, and we have a partnership with West, and so we're all sort of in this together and talking about mental health and well-being. So they put a couple of polling questions into their last poll. So this is literally hot off the presses. So thinking about people, basically these are the questions, right? So is your earning potential limited, or are you worried that it's limited by ADHD, anxiety, depression? And 34% are concerned. I think also very interestingly enough, 38% don't think their employers are doing enough, around this issue. And so I think we're going to continue to, poll on these issues and think about that aspect so that we can continue to build out. And there's actually also on your website an incredible amount of already the well-being initiative, statistics and everything that they pulled together. I also wanted to introduce, the Kennedy Forum does most of our work in the United States, and we've set out what we call a North Star goal, public health goal, of 90-90-90 by 2033. And we translated into employers. So this is the translation, but it's basically 90% of people getting screened. So do we know whether you have a substance use or a mental health issue so that you can go get diagnosis and care, making sure you get evidence-based care. And then we say moving towards recovery when we're talking about the whole community. In the context of business, it's, do your employees understand it? Are they engaged in it? Are they getting the care they need? And then are they working at peak performance? So, recovery across the board in this case would be more on the peak performance side so that we can see all those skills that WEF, lays out. And we could say, yes, those our employees have those things. And so just thinking about, again, employers and that lens, I just wanted to point out the ecosystem, because I do think, this is not just something that employers can solve. There is a whole community approach that needs to happen, and so some partnerships and thinking about the ecosystem is important. And then innovation, around access to care. These are just a few examples, and I just want to highlight that they by no means are everything that these companies are doing, but we just thought it would be really interesting to give a couple of specifics. So there's 6 high-impact brain health drivers, so thinking about stress, sleep, access to healthcare, cognitive engagement, physical activity, and mindset and beliefs. And so these are just a couple of examples, obviously, of very large companies. And what they have, their outcomes basically on addressing these different issues in different ways in the company. And again, they address many of, like Pepsi also does cognitive engagement, for instance. We wanted to just sort of show a visual around this is 100 employees. And when you think about the life course, I forgot to mention earlier that it's not only about like me as an individual as I move through those stages, but it's about me as a mom and a daughter, and that interconnection of all of the different things that that happen. So when you think about this 100-person workforce, up to a third, highlighted now in blue, have a mental illness, substance use issue, or both, right? So right there, you have a significant amount of your employees, again, just by the data and the averages. And then when you think about, when you add a layer, 1 in 5 are caregivers for elderly or disabled loved ones. So we're dealing with things at home or, that we're thinking about in the caregiving context. Then half are experiencing symptoms of burnout. And these are from, surveys that have been done. And then you layer in 20% feel like they have a toxic work environment. So now you're looking at a very significant workforce issue, where the minority of people in your organization are not having anything in their lives that they're having challenges with. I shouldn't say it quite like that, but, of the challenges that we laid out. So just thinking about, what priorities that we can, through this. We think about really a holistic approach. By a company is like a really important piece. Brain health and brain skills cross-generationally, and thinking about it in that way, in that life course perspective. And investment. I mean, the savings obviously, over time has to be clearer. And, we need to be thinking about how we really look at that as a competitive advantage. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Steve, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that. And what we're going to do now is have a panel, get a chat going. This is such an intimate, wonderful space that I want all of you to think that I talked to you at the reception, and we may not be able to get everybody in, but that I said, hey, when we get to Q&A or conversation, to imagine I ask you to make a provocation. Don't reinvent the wheel, but just poke us a little bit to kind of think in a big way. I also want to call out my friend John Clifton. You should stand up, John. You're like so modest. John, stand up, man. He's a great guy. Stand up. Own it. Own it. John is my buddy from DC and Gallup. This is his first Davos. And he's a wonderful guy. But let me introduce our panel here. We've got the great Patrick Kennedy, who's, of course, the founder of the Kennedy Forum. Patrick, come on up and join us up here. We've got Sherry Bronstein, who's the Chief Human Resource Officer at Bank of America. I can't wait to talk about brain capital with capital. And we're going to do that. We've got Tim Lash, who's the president of West Health and a real substantial partner in all of this. And I just want to tell you, so you know a little bit about this as we get into it, he's done fantastic work about really the kind of broad process of aging, which is something I'm fascinated by, and in my view, the deficit of attention in a lot of this area, which I think we're trying to correct today. And then we have Lucy Perez, who's a senior partner at McKinsey, and she's been doing a lot of work on health equity, women's health abroad the board. I mean, you've done the whole package, but I just wanted to call those things out. So why don't we take a seat, have a chat, and let me just start out, and I'm going to do this in a different way, because Patrick and I have been through this before, and I want to just level set and have you level set with us, because sometimes in Davos, pictures get painted of how the world is as we would like it to be. I'd like to hear how you see it is, and as we begin thinking about the connectivity between brain health, employers, creating a greater connection of that, how big a lift do you feel it is that of the work that we need to do out there broadly in society to kind of make that connection between brain capital and the employers?
Thanks, Steve. I really am grateful for our friends who made this last presentation possible and who are stepping up to really help advocacy, because advocacy needs all the help it can get. I often say, we're stuck in a time warp because the advocacy reflects a different time where we only thought about mental health in terms of mental illness. And obviously, as of late, we're starting to see it much more comprehensively. And it's taken a long time for us to evolve to that, but to show it in such graphic ways and to have the benefit of people who know how to present in a way that is compelling to businesses really helps.
It's tangible.
It's so tangible. Our other partners, KPMG, and isn't it something? The reason I got KPMG is I had one of their principals call my cousin, one of my cousins who they were friends with, because they had my book, and asked me to help them get help for their child. And they are like big time KPMG people, right? That's how we got KPMG, right? And I got just anecdotally, I had in the last year a major partner in Goldman Sachs, his father, who's friends with one of my other cousins, called me and said he needs to get help, but he's, a Harvard MBA. He doesn't know that he needs help, but here are all the problems. What can you do to help? The thought that a major partner at an enormous investment banking firm that has every resource in the world is like reaching through this circuitous route to kind of get help is kind of shocking. And the fact that I got a call from Speaker Pelosi just a couple years ago to have me come in and try to do an intervention on one of my former colleagues, I could just go on and on. It's remarkable that even people who have all the resources in the world can't navigate this. And so that's the proof is in the pudding. We can do all of this, but when the reality is...
But just to jump in real quick, because you're talking about the human connectivity that people have in their lives, that it's beneath the, behind the door, it's, you scratch around and, the most powerful people in the world or the least powerful people in the world have this out there. But when you kind of look at the data that we just saw and how companies and employers, it gives them something that I think is bigger than personal experience. I mean, that's the whole thing. How do you go from being a boutique to becoming standard?
No, I mean, in this time with the new administration, we need to make this case on the money, on the cost-benefit analysis, on the ROI.
Right.
Because if businesses have the template where they can demonstrate that there are savings by doing something that otherwise would be seen as liberal, progressive, lefty, but is now seen as essential to the success in business in America, that totally shifts. And by the way, that carries over politically, so that we're not only making a difference with companies that have large voice, especially in a new administration, more so than many of the advocates, but then the government is also thinking, wow, this is not in the old paradigm of all those advocates are pressing us to try to do something that isn't right. It's just a cost and a burden on government.
Tim?
I think, Corda, what you're asking is, how is it really financially, right?
Well, I think it's how is it financially, and how do you go from what we've now learned from data, and you're turning and you're breaking this up into pieces. And this is something companies or associations can absorb and deal with, that gets you from the fuzzy to the more concrete, and looking at that connectivity between employees and the social contract around them. So
I get that, but I just want to make a point around financially, how is it really? I was at a panel yesterday. We were talking about GLP-1 drugs, and one of the employers said that they spent $150 million last quarter on the GLPs for obesity, and that's impacting earnings. Right? Healthcare has always impacted earnings. It's just happened over a very slow period of time. When healthcare was at 10% of GDP, then 11. It's just a slow increase, right? If you could decrease it, that would increase earnings as well, right? And so why is behavioral health a focus here? It's the only chronic disease, and it is a disease, right, where morbidity and mortality has continued to go up. We're treating behavioral health like we treated cardiovascular disease in the 1970s. And what do I mean by that? 1970s, you have a heart attack, right? You survive. Hopefully, right? And they tell you need to go on a low-fat diet. That's what we did, right? What do we do now? We do cholesterol testing, we do calcium scores and other things to be able to predict those things, right? We don't do that for behavioral health. We don't do that at all, right? And if we could have a tremendous impact on healthcare spend, because it's not suicide that's actually killing people with severe mental illness. It's cardiovascular disease and other chronic conditions because they can't get the healthcare that they need. And that has a huge economic impact on employers.
Well, the jump I think we're going to get at today to build in, kind of touch on that, and I would love Sherry to talk about it, is brain capital. And to have another, basically a term and a currency, if you will, not to jump on the capital, but a way to kind of talk about how we think more constructively about what the building blocks of mental and brain health are. So Sherry, I'd love to hear about how Bank of America is thinking about brain capital and how it could revolutionize, just to attend, to talk to what Tim said, the trends are going in the wrong direction. How can we take a methodology and basically get things to become reinforcing and net positives moving in the right direction?
So first of all, I love the presentation. It's one of the best presentations I've seen on this topic, the way you all have brought all the different aspects together. And, I could come at this from so many different directions. So let me try a few things. At the end of the day, our people are our biggest asset. They're also 60+% of our costs. So at
Right.
the end of the day, we need to make sure we're investing in our people. We need to make sure they're successful in both their professional and personal lives. That we ensure we have about 200,000 employees. We ensure we're self-insured, not surprisingly. About 85% of our people are in the U.S. So, that means we're covering almost 1 million lives in
Right.
general. So those are all the people we're taking care of, and we want them to be productive. So if you think about the mental health piece, and I'll talk about our entry level for a minute and how that impacts us. We hire about 2,000 full-time campus hires a year. The number one thing on their mind is mental health. They come in, they talk about it, they ask questions, they want to know what's there for them. We can't be an employer of choice if we're not talking about it, we're not providing benefits, we're not both proactively and reactively, meaning, ensuring that that people have what they need. And we invest a lot there. It's also, on the cost side, it's a top 5 cost for us.
So it's part of the culture.
It's part of the culture.
So I want to ask you, I want to push you a little
Exactly,
bit, because a lot of companies out there, you open this door and you
Yeah.
get tagged with stigma.
Yeah. No,
How do
we-
you avoid the stigma
honestly,
in the front door?
and we've done a lot of work with Patrick and others. We started, Brian and I and the management team, we really started on this when we started to see the data, and top 5 costs for us.
For
Number
the
one-
audience, Brian Moynihan, CEO of Bank of America.
Yeah, it's one of our top leave categories. We have
Right.
100,000 hourly employees, so you can imagine if you can drive your leave, your leave cases down. It's one of the top reasons for short-term leaves. And we just started hearing these stories. So there was the hard data, but there was
Right.
also the soft data of, we'd be in a town hall and Brian would talk about it. It's okay to talk about this at work. And people would stand up and start telling stories. And we have a culture of caring about our people. And I've had so many people say to me, look, the bank's a great place to work, but it's never greater than when you're in need. Just this week, as I was leaving for here, got a call from one of my colleagues, my child's in crisis, and I think to the point that's been made is, it's not just our young people, but it's parents. We see, the mental health demand really coming from our entry level, but also parents. It's a daily conversation with parents, and then people taking care of elder parents as well. And so, we really, in order to keep our attrition low, to be a great place to work, to attract new talent, we really need to invest. And then it's everything about, on the brain capital side, how we invest in skills. We have 1,000 people who do upskilling, reskilling, and just keeping people constantly learning. And we just celebrated, every year we celebrate people who have been with the company for over 50 years, and we bring them
Right.
in, and Brian recognizes all of them. And, these people have been with the company for 40 years. They've had incredible careers, and you listen, you'd think they were 30 years old, because they're still engaged. They're amazing.
So let me move beyond I'm going to be tough love here, the fuzzy to the specific.
Yeah.
So I read the McKinsey study that the forum helped produce, and looking at some of the components of this: stress, sleep, community engagement, health risk factors, social support, physical activity. These are all elements of levers that are part of the cognitive makeup of someone. And then your incentives here, increased retention, which you mentioned, or productivity, innovation, creativity, reduced healthcare costs, which Tim was getting into, and adaptability at this. So when you're building a culture, just so for folks who are in this business, how are you moving these levers in a specific way so that we move from the general, and you're operating and you're looking at 1 million people and costs, I'd just like to get just a sense of the tangibility, if you will, of what elements you move. Because we can all talk generally about the importance of mental health, but how do you move the needle?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, it does start with the data, and when we really started on this journey, we did a lot and we were always looking at our healthcare data, but, we could see the increasing costs. We also do surveys, and we were getting people saying, I'm not coping with stress. And when 20% of your workforce tells you they're not coping with stress, that's a call to action, both, again, on the cost side and the human side. And so, you build programs, you work with external experts, and you say, what is going to work? And we've tried lots of different things. Some have worked better than others. A lot of it is access to benefits. It's lifting the stigma and embedding that in the culture. And also managers are key. So we've done a lot of manager training. We've worked with Ariana Huffington at Thrive, and we've trained our 20,000 managers to recognize the signs in their employees, but also to make sure they're taking care of themselves.
Lucy, I'd love to hear from you a little bit on how to do this, because another element of this that isn't often discussed is, I think it comes into what Tim was saying. There's an increasing anxiety out there. I mean, it's fascinating when you look at economic numbers out there. Markets are sky high, unemployment's real low, but if you go out, anxiety is high. I don't know if it's because of technology coming or, people feel stress. And I'm just interested as you kind of look at, that and these economic conditions, as you sort of look at in the studies and work you've done, how do you embed in it the tools to help one decrease anxiety and build resilience with people?
Thank you for that question, because indeed these days it's all about adaptability and resilience. That's how workforces thrive at a time of constant change and stressors, which I think we're all very familiar with, right? And so when you think about what enables you to have that adaptability and resilience, it's those brain skills, right? It's when we're talking about, emotional intelligence, creativity, analytical thinking. But to have that, you also have to have positive brain health as a foundation, right? And that's how, you think of brain health and brain skills together. That's what makes brain capital happen, right? And I think for too long we've been talking, right? Health is foundational. Improvements in human health is what has led to the most economic productivity for the last 200 years, right? But for too long, we've been focused on physical health, right? I think what's really exciting now is this increased recognition about mental health, right? That we need to think of health holistically. And indeed, you look at, employer cost in this space, right? They're right now on the order of close to 10% of healthcare costs that an employer is making today is tied to brain health. When we looked at some of the data in terms of what's the anticipated overall spend on brain disorders, we're about in 2025 estimated on the order of $5 trillion. By the time you get to 2030, it'll more than triple. So if this is not part of the call to action, it's kind of, what is, right? We've got the numbers not only of how this is skyrocketing in importance, but also the huge economic impact, right? I love how Rebecca shared, at an individual company level, because sometimes the big numbers are hard to process. I'll tell you the big numbers. The impact of addressing this is $26 trillion in economic productivity. But that may not feel so tangible. So that's why I like to also, we need to make it.
It's a very big number that is bigger than all these countries put together.
Yeah.
So it's
But this is why it's so important for organizations to be looking at their data, but then hand in hand with that, and Sherry, you alluded to it, is the leader's voice, right? Because that's what helps address the stigma you were referring to earlier, right?
Well, I read your study, and so the McKinsey Health Institute study that you put out was fascinating, and and you kind of look at the scale of the costs of not moving forward.
Yeah.
But I guess I ask the same question I asked Patrick: why isn't it happening more quickly? Because it's sort of economically, the incentives are there. And so I think you're showing people, you're giving them calipers to do what's in their interests. But what's impeding our system, our collective ecosystem, from moving more quickly into a world where cognitive and mental health and brain capital, becomes essentially, to go to his old word, the law of the land?
I would say, unfortunately, we've been slow to act, right? So the level of awareness is not there. I think of, and I'm sure if we go around and poll this group with many people who've been coming to Davos for a long time, they haven't been hearing about
Right.
brain health, right? For me, this is the first Davos where I'm really
Well, this guy was
seeing-
our first guy here.
It's about
here in the
time,
morning,
right?
Front
Yeah,
row.
exactly.
And no, I'll come to you in a minute. Not yet, not yet, not yet. I'm just going to praise you that you know a lot about brain health. So there's some real, people here, but
Yes.
hopefully we've got some others that are learning here.
So,
Yeah, Patrick?
Luz, we're in the midst of this Doge thing where they're going to just slice and dice healthcare, and it could be catastrophic in terms of the seismic impact that these cuts could make. If we had an ability to capture with your inputs, if we're moving towards CCMI about value-based contracts, like how do we construct those contracts to get the demonstrations of value that if we're going to, quote, make America healthy again, you can't do it with these chronic illnesses without leading with mental health. So what I'm saying is the impact of your work now on behalf of those who are in the business world actually has a powerful opportunity to impact right now some important
Because
decisions
business
that are
can
gonna-
drive it.
Yeah,
because
I-
business can drive it, and it'll also, government's going to try to do a lot of catch up in terms of their own thinking about this. And who knows, Oz is a surgeon, and does he really get all of this stuff? We need to make sure we inform the leadership there.
I just want to make a comment on that. Historically, the governments, right, have played a very significant role on value-based contracts and design. And we've taken a journey. I think we've gotten lost, and we're now completely disoriented, right? And why has government focused there? It's because by and large, they cover older adults, right? And older adults historically have consumed the vast majority of healthcare because they have more chronic conditions, et cetera, et cetera. Well, guess what? A 50-year-old today is not a 50-year-old, in the 1970s. They look a lot like a 70-year-old, right, in the 1970s or
Right.
the 1980s in terms of their chronic conditions.
Right.
And we're heading, with some of the reforms into an area, I think, globally where there's less regulation and less oversight. And that puts incredible pressure and responsibility on an employer, right, to take action here and drive the plan design and what's available in terms of the delivery models, right? Employers, have an employee base, but they also have a tremendous impact, over
Tim,
the communities that they're in.
Take it a step further into some of your great work on aging. My friend Nancy Lamond, who's the EVP of AARP, has a great line. I constantly quote her. Said, "The future of retirement is work." And so what you see is, people who are aged are staying in the workforce. They're in the workforce. You need them in the workforce. But yet our modality of dealing with it from every dimension of health is not caught up. And I'd just love to hear from you if there were 3 big structural shifts. Because I thought moving to wellness in our health system would do it. But what happens is mental health is left off the map. And I'm just interested in what you would fix if we gave you all the power.
So I think it's best through an example. So we launched a project, and we do a lot of work with Northwestern in Chicagoland, right? And they are a large employer, right? They're also a health system, which is interesting because they exert a tremendous amount of influence on the delivery of healthcare in their community, but they're also responsible as a self-insured employer for a very large, employee base.
Right.
And like any other organization, they have ESP programs. They do their surveys. They look at anxiety, depression, and other things. It's increasing, as is the age of their workforce, right? And so they have, sort of growing financial exposure, which again hits earnings, but it just has hit, sort of over time. They also have done a great job, and Gallup, I think, is instrumental, right? For organizations in doing this, in asking the question why several times. So like, why do we see sort of the increase? And sometimes it's because of the lack of an employee support program, right? And sometimes it's because of something organic or structural to the organization itself, whether it's management or culture or processes, et cetera. And they and others have done a very good job of making investments in that as well. But sometimes it's organic to the individual, right? When we think about behavioral health, anxiety, depression, et cetera, right? There's a psychopathology, right, that exists. And sometimes, yoga or listening to something like might not be enough, and a better manager might not be enough. And so they've taken steps to integrate primary care and behavioral health across their entire network. And that's something that we're working with them on. And when you do that, right, you come at it from those 3 angles. You asked about structural changes, right? You need structural changes within the organization to have some of the support programs. Sometimes you need to change the organization itself, right? And sometimes you need to make the structural changes in the delivery of healthcare, right? And the plan design so that people can get the care that they need. And guess what? If an employer does that because it has an ROI for their bottom line, for their earnings, it also accrues benefit to the broader community, including seniors that aren't working.
Sherry, let me ask you a question about another bit of framing change that I think that you're involved with. I may get the language wrong, but life course, or the life course of brain health and brain capital, that when you look at the longevity, I think it's interesting. I've been really fascinated in kind of continuing education and how, we don't have embed, kind of go to college and you're done. One and done, it's over. As opposed to thinking, now they call non-traditional students, people who continue to educate, learn, keep going. I'm sort of wondering what we can do in the health world where we're just talking about youth and moving from youth to, various different dimensions of our lifespan, and how employers, to come back to the employer base in this, can help create a new norm, if you will, over a life course.
Yeah, I think, and I should say, an interesting point is if you asked me 10 years ago how much time I spent ever thinking about like healthcare or benefits, it was like this much. Like this is
Right.
for CHROs, and we were talking about before CFOs,
Right.
a major topic. And so really having to educate, because it's not my background, on how we think about exactly what you're saying. And so for us, it's really thinking about that life event. And I'll tell you, like, one of the things that we started to see, I'll talk about women for a minute, was menopause, right? And not that it hasn't been out there for a million years, but we started talking about it. We invested in a partnership with Maven. We saw, it was very interesting because what we saw was women don't want to talk to our insurers. They want to talk to someone who focuses on this. But what we've done, going back to the life courses, is they've now stepped into the prenatal care, the
Right.
postnatal care, and they will help with pediatric care up to 5 years old. And so very interesting different models as we think about, we have 40+% women in our top couple levels of the company. And so we've got a lot of women in those age groups. So we've really been looking at what are the different needs and segmenting. Primary care, really important, especially post-COVID. We've really refocused on primary care because we could see in our data these chronic conditions, whether it was on the mental health side, the physical health. So one of what we've really been trying to think about is healthcare and the whole ecosystem much more strategically from different parts of people's lives, because we do have a lot of people in our workforce that have worked for us from 40 years, 50 years. And then on the skill-based, we do a lot internally, but we also have continuing ed. You can get reimbursed up to $70, $200 a year to take courses, to get certifications. And you think about, that's not just for the person, it's also for us, the changing in technology. We have, we used to have 500 people in our cybersecurity area. We have 3,000. They're constantly learning new skills, taking new certificates, and we help support all of our employees in that.
Patrick, you've been working for many, many years with youth and thinking about youth workforce, and I'm just interested in what you've learned about embedding in young people the tools to deal with some of these issues, that get to resilience, adaptability, talking about these issues and being not passive, but active agents for their own.
I'm going to turn
health.
this over to my better half, who's a
Amy?
public school teacher.
Way better.
Public school teacher.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Amy?
Yeah,
Well, thank
hi.
you. I hope that's an okay question.
Yeah, it is. No, it's terrific. I was just going to say, a lot of times when we
Thank
think
you.
about brain capital, it's important to remember that these are teachable skills. All of the resilience and the problem solving, this isn't something that later we just have to address. Because we know they're coming up without them.
So we can be proactively.
We could be
yeah.
proactive. In the same way, Tim and I, we've talked a lot about dyslexia, and there's decoding skills that you teach for literacy. There's all of those skills that at one time when we did special education and IEPs, we would write in things that needed to be addressed, and we do adaptations and we do interventions. We need to be doing that for these skills as well. And we can start that early. We can do prevention, we can do screening, we can teach these skills, but that's something that we really need to see come. Again, I hate to keep putting it back on businesses, but it was business that brought us STEM education.
Right.
And said, we need these skills from our future workforce. And so it's business that needs to say, we need these skills from our future workforce, and we have to be teaching them. It needs to be part of the curriculum, that you understand how your brain works and that you're learning these skills in school.
Are you finding it spreading well, I mean, we talked about KPMG, we've got B of A here, we've got the McKinsey study, but again, are you finding these, best and promising practices around this, particularly in the employee-employer relationship? Do you find it being picked up?
I think there's a lot more focus on it, how we can support through the EAPs and how we can bring in some of the, soft things that we're talking about. But I think there's a long way to go on moving it, further and younger to promote this. Because, we've talked a lot about technology at this and social media throughout Davos. But the emphasis on reconnecting young people because it's the future workforce, I think we could still do better there.
Lucy and Tim, I'd love to get a sense, because I think one of the things that was striking about this morning was Rebecca's presentation of the data. And I'm always interested when we're moving into areas that are, have traditionally been, people kind of know, we want to have, mentally sound, brain capital sounds great, but the data really matter. Experience matters, because it's the only way you're going to bring people in. I'm just interested in what the state of data is in this world. And if you can talk about what we would need to do, again, structurally, to bring much more data and empirical evidence into the brain capital world.
Yeah, happy to start. And Tim, let's do this one together, right? I would say it's very nascent. The state of data is nascent.
And you're McKinsey, so I mean, you're
You
kind
know
of like
we dig
you're kind
hard,
of like
right, to
Wizard
try
of
to
Oz.
find that
I mean, I feel like
data.
McKinsey is sort of plugged in everywhere. So if it's nascent for you, then it's
Yes.
non-existent for many.
Exactly, right? And I mean, and I think, we can, think about individual organizations. What are we measuring? We're still also just, figuring out what are the right things to measure, because hand in hand, that's how we generate the data, right? I think it also highlights the criticality of understanding different groups. Whenever we look at health, right, it's not about a one-size-fits-all, but really understanding unique needs. I mean, you talked about women's health earlier and thinking about menopause, right? So I think as we look ahead, it's really important that we make sure how we're addressing brain health, that it's in an inclusive way, to use the word that Patrick referred to earlier, and that as we think about this data, that we also think about how we're deploying it in a very responsible way. Back to the thinking about the stigma that you alluded to, that oftentimes can get in the way of what type of data maybe employees are willing to share, right, as you think about that. And so for me, I mean, one of the things that I would talk about is, indeed, we're in the nascent stage, but with the increased attention to this, we will be generating a lot more data, right? And technology allows us to generate a lot more data, not only to understand the baseline of where we are today, but most importantly, what works best. Because that's what we all want, right? Is to figure out what are those targeted interventions that work best, that can be deployed at scale.
Let me just say to
Patrick,
Lucy,
Tim.
we need this in government. I mean, government's the biggest spender, and government does not see the data and the scoring of the impact of various interventions across minimizing criminal justice costs, human services costs, foster care, housing. And if we're siloed in our thinking in terms of our budgeting. We're not manifesting the real savings that the government could do. So when McKinsey and BOA and everyone else starts to think about this, they're also doing it on behalf of a broader thought pattern that we need kind of at the highest levels of decision.
What I hear from Sherry, though, is really important. I'm just going to be blunt. I'm sure B of A loves its people, but you also laid out and said, this is our bottom line, right? We're paying a lot of money. We're losing a lot of money by not. So you're being shrewdly self-interested in worrying about the mental health of your people, which is a very different argument.
Our healthcare costs are $2+ billion. So, every quarter our CFO comes in and says, what are you doing to make this better? And that's the dialogue.
So have you noticed real impacts on the bottom line?
Look,
have you been able to measure?
We have been able over the course of the last decade to keep healthcare inflation lower than the average of what's happening out there, about 1%. It is still growing. It's still growing, faster than any other cost, but we've been able to be below the inflationary rate by about 1%. Some of that's physical health, some of it's mental health. And then really the turnover, the absenteeism, the leaves, I mean, especially
Right.
in our, in our hourly workforce, if we have 20% of people out on leaves in our consumer business, I mean, those are financial centers not opening,
Right.
I mean, or we've got to have 20% more people than we need.
So you've got a bottom
So
line.
we've got it on the.
Tim, I'd love to get back to evidence.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the evidence because I think data has many facets, right?
Right.
And so no doubt we are lacking data across the board, including how big is the problem. Houston, we have a problem. And we can interrogate that more, but there's a problem, right? But there's also a lack of data around sort of evidence-based screening and the therapies and then the follow-up, right? And so why is that? It's because we've treated mental like dental, right? Somehow it's been segmented off as like a different area of health, right? And so when I cited that mortality and morbidity, only chronic condition, right, where it's rising,
Right.
it's not because it's necessarily harder. I mean, the brain is complex, so is the heart and everything else, right? It's just we've underinvested, in that space, and the time's got to stop,
Right.
right? And I think employers have, can play a very critical role, right, in saying this is important. We need to think about, additional data, not just for, what are the circumstances for our employees, but like really start looking at the evidence of where should we screen, when should we screen. I happen to think that primary care is the common denominator, right,
So-
to reach as many people as
So
possible.
Tim,
and then look at the
well,
interventions.
let me just real quick, why isn't water running downhill there? Who's the villain in the story that's keeping that from happening?
You got to follow the dollars, right? I think that's where it ultimately lies.
So that's to Lucy. Like, when you're studying this, do you really advise when it comes to the insurers, when they decide to minimize their network or just by default because they're not paying therapists enough? And do you advise your clients to spot check the impact on presenteeism, absenteeism, early leave, because that's also interesting, because if the true fiduciary is the business, not the insurer, then that changes the whole complexion
Right.
of the decisions that insurers are making.
Well, I think this is why we're having this conversation from an employer standpoint, right? Because indeed, business has such a huge role to play here. I mean, one thing I do want to make clear from my prior comment in saying that we're in a nascent state when it comes to a lot of data, not for the business case. I feel like the business case, it's crystal clear. Every organization knows
Right.
how much they're spending. They're looking at the trend lines,
Sure.
right? Where we are is more as we think about the interventions. How am I measuring, particularly so I can prevent?
Right.
Because we know it's that much more expensive if we look to intervene and address on the back end. And so that's where we need the help, right? So that what are those markers that I'm tracking, right? How I am leveraging that data and technology that allows me to intervene earlier because the business case is so clear.
Well, look, I want to get to, or did you want to say something, Sharon?
I was just say, we have a lot of good metrics in the mental health space on sort of usage. We can see
Right.
when our summer interns come in, our EAP usage going up, but it is harder to get to the outcomes because I think the whole system is still so fragmented. And so, we think we're doing a good job because, through surveys and talking to our people and trying to keep control of the cost, but it is hard in this space. Whereas, we're starting to see like on the GLP-1s, like the data, like just to take a different topic because it's pretty specific, like you can see very specific data. Okay, we're spending more, but the BMI of our employee base is coming down, and we're starting to see less cardiac, less diabetes. It's unbelievable how quickly we're getting outcome data. I think it's very hard to have.
And it would be
outcome.
criminal if we don't leverage that increased focus on GLPs to have a broader discussion of what else is possible, across the lifespan, right, for the employees and across, sort of the broader health
Because
needs.
of the expense of GLP-1s, if you could talk about how we're seeing the net savings, then you could apply that same thinking to mental health, which is going to need a longer ROI. But if businesses are already thinking, GLP-1s, in 5 years, I'm going to see this reduction in healthcare costs, then they can set up a financial system that, in terms of their reinsurance or how they purchase insurance, that could be
Well, Patrick,
applicable
what
to
you're
mental
saying
health.
is that business is already doing dynamic scoring, and the government is not.
Thank you for saying that,
And,
Steve,
I mean-
because I was totally lost in what I was trying to explain
Yeah.
until you crystallized
but
it for me.
that's it, and you're right. I mean, it's just one of these things that government seems unable to begin looking at the kind of investments.
I just want to make a comment on that and be hopefully a little bit provocative, right? So the dynamics that we're talking about in terms of the employer, we have an aging population. There's more, exposure to healthcare, right? Behavioral health is a key driver of healthcare. We have a new president of the United States, right, who has threatened to pull out of NATO, right, if the EU bloc of NATO doesn't increase their defense spend from 2% to 4 or 5%, right? So what are the dynamics that we're seeing from a government perspective, right, in Europe, right? Well, we have a contraction of the historical the size of the population of a working age, right? We have healthcare costs that are soaring with, behavioral health being a significant component of it. And if you had to increase your defense spending as a percent of GDP, right, you either, right, or both have to decrease other areas of your spend, healthcare, second to defense, very large area of spend, or you need to increase the productivity of the workforce. That's not going to happen by technology alone.
Right.
So if you increase the size of the productivity, you need an older workforce, so we're going to have greater exposure to healthcare. And you also have to compress the healthcare spend, and behavioral health is a key piece of it. So it's not just employers. The governments have, I think, big incentives to do the same thing. The ROI is there as well. It's just at a different scale.
Okay, that's why
I was going to say that, and Tim, you said it just the way I told you to before this program. That was so well done.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
All my original thinking expressed so eloquently.
Let's get some questions and comments from the audience. We've got tons of comments and questions. I promise you first, but make them short because we will get to a lot of people. But right here. And we've got somebody, do we have somebody running around? Okay, great.
Thank you. My name is Morris Friedman. I'm a behavioral neurologist, cognitive neurologist. My field is dementia. And I'm here on behalf of the World Federation of Neurology. Now, a lot of what we're hearing at this session, and really right through all of the Brain House, focuses on the mild, the early, the prevention. All of that's very appropriate.
Right.
But there's a huge problem out there with people who actually have dementia, and there's a great strain on the workforce there. So what I'd like to hear is, what are your thoughts? All of these great thoughts about dealing at the mild end.
Right.
What are your thoughts about addressing the problem at the other end, which is the patients with severe dementia?
Right, thank you.
And there's actually almost no discussion about that at these sessions. And if you don't deal with that, you're missing a big part of
Thank you.
workforce resilience.
Great.
So I'd
And
like
we've
to
got a
hear
mic
what-
right here, so
what
we'll give
you
this back to Patrick.
Can I give a very candid answer very
please,
quick to
please
that?
do.
So at West Health, we've recently launched a portfolio focused on brain health, right? And underneath that, big focus on behavioral health and a big focus on Alzheimer's. And as we were looking at Alzheimer's, one of the reasons that we wanted to invest in that area is that, if you looked at, just a year or two ago, the forecasts for pharma, for the monoclonals, right? We could have seen hundreds of $500+ million a year of direct marketing to drive people in for screening and diagnosis, because that's what would have been necessary, right, for the forecasts to actually be realized. As part of that, we also looked at, what other, interventions and where is their need. And caregiving, back end, it's absolutely critical. The problem is the ROI, right? And so from a screening, diagnosis perspective, which we're nascent today, we don't have the systems in place. You can start to stitch together, like, how does the dollar flow, that there's an incentive across the value chain for people to make investments in those areas. When we think about the back end, it's critically important, if not more important, but finding where the dollars come from. When you look, so U.S., focused, if you look at where, some of the proposals have been for caregiving and other things, they're just not there. It's just, a sand on a speck of sand on a beach, right, in terms of the problem. And so I agree, it's a very critical issue, and I'd love to talk more about it, but like, where do you get the dollars to make the investments to move the needle in a material way?
But, yeah. Right.
I don't have an answer for that. I want one.
A little bit, but I will also say, because I've done a lot of roundtables around the United States on the questions of early screening and dementia. Why isn't the ecosystem there that's positive? It gets back into essentially the sense of personal risk in a lot of this stigma and whatnot. That's why I'm so fascinated with what Sherry has created inside Bank of America, where you've got just much more culture. But I've been doing things with community leaders, businesses, others, and just saying, if you were to tweak the system so there was more discussion and awareness and evolution of this, so that people were actually saw early screening and testing as a positive. And I think you wanted to jump in real quick and then we
Very
go here.
quickly,
Yeah.
because indeed there's a massive gap between the need and the funding that is
Right.
required to meet that need. And frankly, that's been one of the motivators behind standing up the Coalition for Mental Health Investment is
Right.
exactly that, right? And that's bringing, McKinsey Health Institute is one of the partners.
Right.
Welcome Clinton Global Foundation, the African Coalition Alliance, right?
Right.
I may be missing another partner, which I apologize
Right.
in advance for, but it is this clear recognition that we have a massive funding gap and the resources that are required.
So great question. I'm glad you raised it. Yes.
Hi, I'm Krista Stasinski. I'm from the Ontario Brain Institute. Love the conversation, totally agree and on board. I want to pick up on something that you said, Lucy, about the importance of having tangible things that we can do. And so I'm going to take you through my train of thought because I've connected different dots and I want to get your reaction on an idea that just sort of crystallized for me. So how do we do this? Stigma is going to be an issue. So as employers and leaders and organizations, we spend a lot of time investing in our future leaders and in our teams doing things like communication tests.
Right.
You do personality assessments, you do EQ assessments. I don't even know if some of these things are still done, but historically, those are things we've seen a lot of. And then when you pivot
Right.
to children, now in schools, if you're fortunate, your kid may have the opportunity to go through a psychoeducation assessment to help you understand
Right.
who you are, how you learn, where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are,
Sure.
and what kind of supports you need. So I wonder if one of the ways to pivot this conversation, going back to a CHRO and how you invest in your future leaders, is if you start talking about it in the sense of, hey, you're going to be a future leader. We want to make our
Right.
teams function really well. I don't think it's called the psychoeducation assessment,
Right.
but is there a way to adapt that for the workplace to really sort of talk about brain capital, enable brain capital without using the B word?
Right. Thank you, Sherry. And we're going to go to this gentleman back here, who's
So I think it's a very interesting concept. I think, I'm going through in my mind. I guess I don't think stigma's as big of issue anymore as a lot of people do for great companies where leaders will speak up. I mean,
Right.
when I tell you it's a daily conversation in our company because everyone's got a kid who needs help, everyone has parents who maybe, may have dementia. And
Right.
so I guess I think it's more of an education. We do a lot of assessment, but I just, to me, I don't know, it's interesting, but to me, that's
see
more
it,
of
but-
like before people get to us. And then when they come to us, it's more about, again, continuing to build resiliency,
Right.
continuing to build and help people understand themselves, but I guess maybe a little bridge too far from
Let's
an
go right
employer
here.
standpoint.
Thank you all for a great panel. My name is Bill Preston. I'm a Global Legacy Ambassador for the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute. It's the only organization founded by Mrs. Parks to carry out her work, life, and legacy in Detroit. I come with a heavy heart, and I'm going to direct this at you, Sherry, because the late Dr. King, one of my greatest role models, said in Chicago in 1966 at a medical health and humane conference, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane because it often results in physical death. This is the conversation. We have a president that's bent over hell. I'm breaking this down, and I know you guys are going to be challenged at the banks. I'm an investor in socially responsible companies. It's coming to the forefront. I pray and honor Mrs. Parks, Dr. King. Ageism, as an older person who might have to go back in the workforce, I have my
Right.
own company. I may have to go to corporate America. Ageism in this issue. I mean, all these things fall under people who have disabilities. All these things fall under D&I. These are talented people that can contribute. Diversity is our strength.
right.
The future
Right.
of the banks, are they looking to pull out of D&I? I just heard the government shut down everything. And,
Thank you. Thank you. Sherry?
So Brian's spoken on this quite a bit over the last couple of days. He's been asked that. And, look, being who we are, we're Bank of America, diversity and inclusion is core to who we are. I mean, we really do look like the communities we serve and the clients that we have. And we are deeply committed to it. And, look, somebody said this yesterday, I thought it was a good quote. If there's, 500 things that we focus on as part of our overall diversity and inclusion,
Right.
there may be a couple things that, look, we're going to have to look at what these executive orders mean, but it doesn't change who we are and the work we do, and the work we do not just internally, but the work we do in our
It's
communities.
implicit bias at work because we're devaluing people based upon what they look like, and we devalue people based upon their illness because We just don't give the same value in healthcare to someone with a brain illness that we do, because we think they're dysfunctional, they're not productive, and they should be pushed aside.
Right here. Yes, thank you.
Good morning.
Thank you very much.
Joshua Haynes, I'm one of the co-founding partners at Masawa. We're the first impact investment fund focused on mental health. What I see is an incredible amount of early stage startups that have amazing innovations in things like employee well-being and dementia that we're investing in.
See everybody.
We're lucky that we're in a trend where more capital is going to this because there's a huge opportunity.
Right.
But we need more innovative capital at the early stages.
Right.
And so how can we incentivize pensions, banks, investment firms to also invest in that more riskier asset class because it's going to pay off?
Tough. Any ideas? Is that a McKinsey project?
Well, I think this is why we've built the business case, right? This is why we're shining the light on the data, on the trends of how this is an increasing area of opportunity.
But could you get the DAFs to do more?
Yes.
Is what I'm that's
Yeah,
what I'm talking
right.
about. All these people have these family funds. They're supposed to be giving to nonprofits. They're managed by Fidelities, other enterprises, and there's lots of money in those.
Yeah, but
DAFs.
it's not just about the capital, right? If you create the market, which is
Right.
employer, you show that employers want it, will use it. If you realign the delivery systems, integrate primary care and behavioral health, et cetera, so the market is there, the capital will follow that, right? So it's not just about stimulating sort of capital to go in. You have to make sure that there's a customer on the back end and
Right.
that has an ROI as
Right.
well.
So we're going to gather a bunch of questions because just about everybody has a question. So we're going to just gather a few of them, but make them quick. We can go lightning round, but me too? Okay, yeah.
Hello, my name is Mitu Storoni. Amazing panel and such powerful illustration earlier. We're talking a lot, we're speaking a lot and doing great things on lifting people upwards and providing a safety net. Have we,
And it's
I wonder what the panel thinks about the idea of kind of flipping this on its head and making work really, really enjoyable and engaging and putting an emphasis on that. And the reason I say this is because I've just written a book called Hyper Efficient, where I argue that
Say
the
it again.
current
I don't think it could be hyper efficient.
hyper efficient,
Yeah.
so the efficient word
And it was
is
the
popular
Financial
this
Times
week.
Book of the Week.
Book of the month.
Book of the
Must
month.
read Book
Whole
of the
month.
month.
Come on, Steve.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't mean to demean your book.
That's all
Yeah.
right. That's all right. And what I point out there is that, in a way, chronic stress and burnout is like repetitive strain injury for the
Right.
mind. And the reason is that we work with the mind using the old template of assembly line manufacturing, which produced quantity over quality. When we switched to brain
Right.
work, we never changed how we worked.
Right.
Now we really must, because now emphasis is moving to quality. So how
Right.
about we change the way we work radically to emphasize creativity, learning, analytical thinking, which are all neuroprotective states.
Great, thank you. I'm going to jump to a few more questions before we jump on that, but I'm going to buy your book. But this gentleman, okay, this gentleman and this gentleman and this gentleman, okay.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, but I'm
You're
just going to
gonna be
tell you
one big
just
one.
one thing. There's a beautiful event today at the museum, and it's Women in Workforce and Menopause Mandate. Are you aware of it?
No.
I got invited on the train when I was going back to Zurich, and I'm
Because
going.
we're here at this cool event. Yeah.
The question is, I mean, the question is, they are ground zero addressing all the issues that you're bringing up.
Yeah.
And my thinking is, I'm going to learn there. I'm in a learning environment.
Right.
I'm just letting you know in case people didn't know
Well,
that.
thank you so
We
much.
gotta work
I
together,
appreciate
for
that.
sure.
Great, let's move to this gentleman, okay? Right over here. Yeah, we'll just keep, yeah. As long as you've got a good zinger, it's great. Go ahead.
I'll keep it super simple. Tom
And tell us
Monahan.
who you are.
Tom Monahan, CEO of a global
Oh,
professional.
Tom. Buddy.
Steve.
How are you?
Sorry, I'm in the dark.
It's an old friend, yeah.
hiding. We come to Davos to see each other. We live about a mile away. I run a global professional services firm named Heidrick & Struggles. Question, what's interesting, and probably for B of A and McKinsey more than anything else, I sort of look at our performance management systems and our frontline leaders and
Right.
say they are the highest leverage thing here, and they got a lot on their plate, and this is new. And I'd love to just hear how we integrate it into a new view of
Well,
performance
I'm going to
management.
turn it around, Tom, because I know you. Give him the mic again. You're now a member of the panel. I mean, I know Tom well. Tom was one of the leaders, CEOs of one of the major advisory firms of the top firms in the world. With the kind of data that you begin to say here, is it beginning to get in the form and shape that you feel many of the people you've interacted with can begin to absorb and apply?
Sure. If there's one thing, what did Oscar Wilde say? Experience is the name we give our mistakes. If there's a mistake I've made repeatedly as a leader, and I've seen companies make repeatedly in driving change efforts, is they often default to do also rather than do different or do better. So that's why I asked the performance management system.
Fascinating. We'll
'Cause
get
if
there.
you-
And let's take this gentleman right here. And I promise we'll get everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Fred Desterbeck, I'm here on behalf of the European Brain Council, Brussels-based advocacy organization for brain research, brain health, and brain care in Europe. The question, I mean, great discussion. Workplace is by excellence an environment where we can create supportive strategies. I'm hearing a lot about the brain skill part of the presentation in the beginning, but probably not enough about brain health. It's a place, workplace is an environment where we can create strategies of early detection, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on strategies for return to work. And the reason for that is that when we surveyed patients from organizations, they were identifying return to work as being the #1 element or feeling where they have overcome an acute episode or where they have won a victory. They made a victory against their disease.
Right. Thank you. And can we take this gentleman right here, and then we're going to go to all of our panelists.
Thanks. John Young. I lead psychiatry for Northwell Health, which is one of the largest health systems in the U.S. We have one of the most mature collaborative care programs. Just to punctuate a point is we lose a lot of money on it, and part of why we lose money and makes it harder to expand is, the real benefit is reducing the medical spend on the comorbid behavioral health with medical conditions, but that doesn't get factored into the equation. And so the way the financing works, it's a loss rather than a net gain. My question is for the employers. So I was at Kaiser for a bit, and we have capitated funding, and then you have members who are there on average 20 years. So you can spend money going to people's homes, getting them to eat better, so you decrease stroke. But that benefit comes 5 years later. But because the members are there for 20 years, you've got
So
everything
Patrick
aligned.
said the ROI is extended.
So just for the employers, like, are your employees with you long enough to really incentivize you to invest in that way?
Great. So let's go through all of these. I know there's a lot, but let's just go down the panel, and you can respond to what you'd like to. But Lucy?
I'm going to take the return to work question because I think what is really interesting as you raise that question is we've talked about the soloing that has been happening, right? Like, is brain health over here, dental expense, right? And I think one of the big unlocks here is really how do we think more in a more integrated fashion around health. So what I've seen in some of the best practices as you think about return to work is, do you have a return to work program that's holistic, that accounts for the different reasons? Because by the way, that woman returning from maternity leave or the father coming back on parental leave is going to be facing similar challenges. So you need to be thinking about this holistically.
Can you also address Tom Monahan's question about the sort of management?
Yes, so lots of change, right? I think we're still like in the early days. I mean, some of the work that we've been seeing is really about focusing on the manager capability building, right? Because that relationship between the employee and their manager is so foundational to the level of engagement, the brain health of that employee. And so, I mean, I think Sherry can probably talk about specific programs that you're
Did you
doing.
want to jump in, Sherry?
Yeah, sure. I think, managers are definitely the tip of the spear here. They have to be educated and supported, and they need to be able to, be empathetic leaders, and that requires both making sure that people are getting the resources they need, that they're listening for issues, but also that as part of performance management, as Tom was saying, that you're talking to the person about their whole self and both their skills, what they're doing, but also how they're doing it. And we do a lot of manager training to make sure there's kind of consistency across that. And that's also a time where, again, when you're talking about people's career aspirations, which we do every year as well as part of development plans, that's part of thinking about building their skills for the future. Again, continuing to invest in their brain health. So I think it's a great point.
And do you have any quick insights in Michu's comment about realigning work to fit with brain rhythms?
I think one of the things when we talk about burnout is capacity and time, and that's something that, as we do ask more of managers in particular, that people struggle with. And I totally agree, it's got to be, and somebody else said it, it's got to be about changing the way we work so that people have, and what that work is, so that people have the mental capacity to have white space to think. And, you know, I personally believe that that's one of the biggest challenges, and it plays into some of the performance management as well as how we do work and returning to the office. And we've actually seen I know this may be unpopular, but getting people back into the office has actually decreased. Our mental health is a lot better since people are back at work than when people were sitting at home on Zoom all day. We have a hybrid model, so we have some flexibility, but community at work is really, really important.
Tim?
You know, I two comments. One, I want to pick up on what's a loss and you know where the returns are, because you have to follow the dollars. As long as we keep looking at these things in siloed buckets, what's the return on the behavioral health? What's the return on the mental? They're linked. You have to look at them holistically, right? And so I'm encouraged that employers, right? You know, there's an ROI there and there's investment, and for those that are self-insured, it is capitated in some way, right? Because they have exposure across the board. But for us to really unlock the full potential across the lifespan, we're going to have to see value-based contracts and risk-based agreements accelerated in terms of their penetration. And unfortunately, at least in the U.S., we've been kind of schizophrenic there, right? If the Fed changed their monetary policy as often as CMMI has changed their value-based pair policies and models, the markets would be all over the place, right? And so we need some stability there, and we need to accelerate the movement to value-based models, which I think is congruent with us, you know, thinking about the body in totality, which includes the brain and the body and the teeth and everything else.
You know, I just love the way you kind of frame some of these things. And I'm going to come to Patrick for the kind of a final wrap-up of what we're doing. But I love the data, and so congratulations on getting it out there. I also think there's another discussion in a future Brain House gathering. I heard this place was built in 9 days, and maybe it's going to disappear next, but I hope it's here next year. We're going to have a discussion, because I think there are interesting public-private opportunities out there around this that may be avant-garde, that may be different, that could invite. Like, I met the mayor of I think it was Oklahoma City a few years ago, and they created this culture where they tried to increase the walkability of the city, and they got people together, and they lost like 1 million pounds collectively, and they got people across racial lines to hang out, begin doing these things together. And so it just felt like, wow, from a mental health perspective, positive, from a issue, you know, related to some of the chronic illness and awareness of this, positive. Corporations got engaged in it, and it was just something that wasn't on anybody's radar screen on how to do. There are elements like that that I think are bank shots that help move us forward, that I hope we look at some point. But Patrick, I want to thank you for pulling us all together and hosting this, but get your, you know, as we respond to these questions too, but also to kind of put a punctuation point when it comes to the employer dimension. And I just think brain capital is a good term. It's sexy, and it's an opportunity. We'd love to hear your final thoughts on that.
Well, your point is the term, and we need a narrative.
Right.
This is such a diffuse issue. It's overwhelming for people, and when it's overwhelming and you can't communicate it in a succinct narrative, it becomes more difficult to advocate for. And people's minds go, oh, that's the issue, people on the street who are talking, oh, that's the issue of disability, and it's overwhelming. I think we need to, on the brain capital and brain as a positive, as opposed to just the negative, which we always associate this with sickness and illness. When I rededicated the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center, and the general there said, we make more of an investment in our mental health of our Green Berets than any other branch of the service, and we're proud of it. I said to him, I know that you saw my CV and that I care about mental health, but come on, these Green Berets don't need mental health. They're amazing. And he said, no, Congressman, we see mental health as a force multiplier. And, you know, he had the, you know. And I'm thinking to myself, if CEOs around America could hear that the Green Berets are like all over this, because they said when they get into the field of battle, they need their six. And I'm like, oh my God, the six. They need to be able to know where all their other teammates are, because all their other teammates depend on them keeping their awareness in the moment. And if they have intrusive thoughts where they're ruminating or thinking about what happened last week or what's going on back home because their family's not being paid, by the way, even minimum wage, that can be disruptive to the mission. And I'm like, damn, that's good. And I'm thinking, we got to take Green Berets around the country to talk about this, because one thing Americans love more than else is to be better, more successful, more beautiful.
Right.
And we'd all want mental health in a positive light if it were framed as capacity building and optimizing all of our ability to be self-actualized. Can you imagine if that was the frame we put? Then everybody would be racing to try to get things to change,
And
to
this is
align
why
to
I
that.
never follow a candidate.
Great way to end things. Let's please give a round of applause to Lucy Perez of McKinsey, Tim Lash of West Health, Sherry Bronson of Bank of America, and of course Patrick Kennedy of Kennedy Forum. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Oh, sure.